Hello, everybody, and welcome to something special. How are you today? I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. Um, I'm sitting here on Saturday. It's like 6 o'clock. I'm doing a little bit of work, as you can see, and it's the task I'm on is a little bit just time consuming, just like waiting. So I figured I'd throw something together quickly that I wanted to do. I didn't know how I would do this properly, but um, a while ago, I made those videos about depth and breadth, talking about the Legend of Zelda. I made one video called "The Breadth of the Wild" and another video called "The Depth of the Wild." And then I discussed topics of breadth and depth and ambiguity in some people's definitions, and I explained some definitions that do make sense. And that's great and all, and that's something I try to keep up on. I listen whenever people try to describe depth and breadth in games. A lot of people never talk about how broad games are. They really talk about depth only when really there's more to talk about. So, anyways, as you could probably guess, our favorite friend did a little blog post recently where somebody asked about, again, the depth of games. And he explained the depth of a very simple game. He went to the base game, and we're going to explore this today, and I'm going to show you how it's kind of wrong, but here we go. Let me put the brightness up on this monitor so that we have a little bit of light. Okay, so the most basic game is you have a coin, right? And you have two possible outputs of flipping this coin. You have heads and you got tails. Okay, this is the most basic game. Now, if the game was passive, if you're talking about like a passive experience like watching a film, well, you only have one output. No matter what you do, you'll always have the same output. No matter how many times you watch a movie, you'll always get the same thing. But in games, there's some element of either choice or chance involved that can affect the outcome, and you want to get to either a success or a fail state. So a fail state normally is like this, and a success state is this. And let's say you're looking for a tails to win. You'll go to the success state, and if you get a heads, you'll go to the failure state. Right. So this is the most basic game, and as you can see, it's a graph. Anyways, so your boy Chris talked a little bit about the depth of a coin flip, where you flip the coin, and if you get a certain thing, you win, and if you don't, you lose. Okay. And he said, this is him trying to explain depth based off his definition. He said that the depth of the coin flip is 2, because there are 2 non-trivial states in the game: the state at which you get the head, the state at which you get the tail. Right? Now, here's the problem. As you can see, it's very clearly a graph. You have a starting node, you have 2 possible nodes at the second level, or really the first level, because this is level 0. And then these success nodes don't really matter because these themselves are the success nodes. This is the failure, and this is the success, right? This is what the graph looks like. This is depth 0. This is the starting point. This is the first level of the game. And that right there, that's depth 1. So the graph of a coin flip, which if you've done any probability in school, if you've done any probability, the most basic probability, you do this in high school, you do the most basic probability, you've seen this graph of a coin flip. You've probably done it, you probably know, before they teach you like conditional probabilities or anything else, or how probabilities stack on each other, you probably did a problem where it was like, what's the probability of getting like 2 coin flips in a row? And you probably drew like this graph, right? Where you drew this, and then you drew heads, tails, and then you just propagated the probability down over and over again, and you probably did some brute force freaking hacking to get the freaking probabilities of everything. So you've seen this, right? This is a pretty complicated graph. It's really stupid. You don't have to do it, but that's a graph, right? And this is the most basic graph. This is like the simplest game. You do one action, and there are 2 possible outcomes. The minimum number of things that can happen that are different from each other is 2, right? And the minimum number of times you can do it is 1. The depth of this graph is 1. The breadth of this graph is 2. The way you can think about it is that breadth, the broad compactness of a game is how many things can happen at the same point in time. So when you flip, when you're at time 0, let's say, which is our depth you can think of as time if you want, right? As a number of actions that can continuously interact with other things and cause more things to happen. So if you're at time 0, at time 1, which is the point at which the coin that you flipped will land on either heads or tails, there are two possible things that can happen at the same point in time. Heads or tails. That's the breadth of the graph. And to just take a word like depth, which has you're talking about a freaking coin flip. This isn't just a game. This is something you talk about in probability. This is something you talk about in a lot of freaking flipping a coin. You talk about this everywhere. It's a graph. And the depth of this graph is 1. And that's what I'm saying. To take a word like depth and say, oh no, actually it's 2, and not to, because you could do it this way. You could say, hey, Lamhoot, you're an idiot. Let's say the starting point is 1 and the other depth is 2. You know what? Good for you. That's wrong, first of all, because the starting point is 0. The root node is 0. Technically, this root node doesn't exist. It's just conceptual, but we leave it there just to make it look good, right? So the depth, the number of things you are doing consecutively is 1. You're only doing 1 coin flip. You're not doing 2, right? You're doing 1 coin flip. The depth is 1. That's just what it is. And then you take this word here, that already has a meaning in this context, in the context of a coin flip, and you say it has a depth of 2, not because of that whole thing like I showed there. You're saying that the fact that there is 2 possible outcomes at time 1, this makes it have a depth of 2. That is literally, this is like the unit game. This is like the unit step. This is the unit of a game. One thing with 2 possible outcomes. This is the simplest possible game you can imagine. And this being next to this, the fact that they're next to each other means that it's not depth. It's breadth. A coin flip with a depth of 2 would look like this. So this is your starting point, right? And at time 1, you get 1 output. You get heads, let's say. And at time 2, you get tails. Now this would be a really, really weird coin. You'd have to imagine a coin that you throw, it lands on one side and then it flips over, and now it's on the other side. That would be, and that wouldn't be a game. That would be a passive experience. This would be no different than watching a movie. This would be something where you wind up a toy and it always does the same thing. I mean, you can use the toy in different contexts and make a game out of it, but this itself is not a game. It's just a sequence of events that are happening. It's a cut scene. It's a scripted moment. It has very defined behavior, and there's no interactivity you can get out of it other than, how many times you want to throw the coin, even though it'll do the same thing every time. But what's interesting about a real coin is that every time you throw it, you have a breadth of possibilities of 2. You have 2 things that can happen: heads or tails, not heads then tails. This is a depth of 2. This is a depth of 1. I don't know how many more times I can say this without hating myself, but this is why this is a problem. By using a word that already has an assignment, right, that already has a meaning, you're just hijacking it inappropriately. I think that's what I said in the video. You can't just hijack a word that has a meaning and then take the word that you're actually talking about, taking breadth, and saying actually this word has no meaning. Because then what you're doing is you're taking a word that has a meaning. So there's the graphical depth, which is equal to 1, and then there's the game depth, your weird game definition of depth, which is 2, and then you're saying, well, breadth, that's just trash. I don't like that word. Well, no, why don't you just forget about this, put this there, That's what that is, right? What is the point? This is the most ambiguous thing you can possibly do with words. To just use you really, really, really want to use the same word twice. And you can see how much of a problem it is when you go to the base game, when you go to the coin flip, the heads or tails. Your definition breaks apart. As soon as you say that the depth of this is 2, the depth of the basic game. If you can't imagine a game that has a depth of 1, if this is not if a coin flip has a depth of 2, and then there's no possible game that has a depth lower than 2. And if your unit game has a depth value of greater than 1, if the depth of the simplest game is greater than the simplest number, you have a problem. Because your unit game's depth is not the same as like the unit number, which is 1. Which is a big problem. And I that's just what bothers me, is that kind of proves it right there. That if you can't take this game, if you can't consider that this game only has a depth of 1, then your word is wrong. Your definition just has to be wrong, because you can't imagine a simpler case than 2, right? And by this logic, by the depth of this game being 2, this is something else I wanted to bring up. So if a coin flip, because it has 2 non-trivial states, if it has a depth of 2, then basically what you're saying is that the most complicated game in the world is one where you take a billion freaking die, right? Imagine this is like a pack of die, and you just chuck them. And depending on the value of all the dice, you take somebody's like social insurance number and you like add all these numbers up, and then you give them like $1 million, right? So the more possible things happen at time 1, the more possible things happen, the deeper the game is, because there's all these non-trivial states. But is that really depth? I mean, you can see it when I talk. When you take the base case and you explode it, you can see how weird it sounds, right? Yes, according to your definition of non-trivial states, yes, there are a billion non-trivial states, because a billion different people can get $1 million, right? But does that make the game deep? Because the way you use depth in other situations isn't consistent with that, right? Isn't that kind of goofy? That the deepest game is one in which just a million different things can happen at the same point in time? Isn't that kind of weird? Isn't depth more about interacting with different states? This state What if this guy gets $1 million, but if he gets $1 million, he has to share it with this guy, and then a bus shows out of nowhere, kills this guy? I don't freaking know. I'm trying to say some jargon. So right there, you can see that. So then, if you want a game example, you want a game that's extremely deep, well, look no further than WarioWare, because WarioWare, the game I chose for an example of a breadthy game, of a broad game, is comprised of a bunch of different mini games that really don't have very much interaction with each other, other than they're in the same collection, right? So at any point in time in WarioWare, you're not playing one game and then interacting with another. You're playing either this game, either this game, either this game, either this game, either this game. It's heads or it's tails. It's the surfing minigame, the skateboarding minigame, the one where you're skiing down the hill, the one where you have to karate chop the piece of wood. It's one of each one of these games. So by this logic, WarioWare is one of the deepest games ever made, right? Because this is how many non-trivial states there are. If you just keep expanding upon this, if you take that base case and you just keep expanding and adding more and more mini-games that have no relation to each other, you have the deepest game. When in reality, no, you don't. You just have a billion different games. You have a very broad game. In this game, you are able to play a broad selection of games, of n different things, right? Your breadth is n, let's say. It doesn't have a depth of n, it has a breadth of n, right? To say, I think anybody could has to agree with that, right? That makes sense. And yeah, that's, I mean, obviously, if there are interactions, you can increase both the depth and breadth. That's the whole idea of multiplicity, right? Is that by building this feature interacts with this one, and then this one loops back, and then there's like a thing and all this. And so what you can do is, instead of filling it up like this way and getting it broad like that, you can build a couple of features, maybe 4 features, but each one of these interacts with all of the other features, and you get something that looks like this. So, you start with 4 possible interactions, and then from these points you would go to 2 possible interactions at this level per node, and and you've increased both the depth and the breadth, right? Right? Does that make sense? This is a game that is both deep and broad. It doesn't sacrifice either of them. That's what I'm saying we should talk about. And this is more consistent with the other definition of of depth, the one where it's the user. What is it? It's the level of interaction that a pro player is able to know versus the level of interaction that a new player is able to know. This is one that a lot of people come up with too. Well, according to that, this game has a depth of 1. Why? Because a new player, let's start with a pro player. The pro player knows that a coin has 2 sides, and when they throw it, it'll either be heads or tails. So they know that there are only 2 things that can happen. Whereas a new player who's never played the game before, well, they look at the coin and they don't understand the coin. What is a coin? What happens? It has 2 sides? Are you sure? Does it have 5 sides? I don't know. I don't know anything about a coin. I don't know what the heads and tails are. Imagine somebody who's never seen a coin and you're saying, hey, I'm going to flip it. What do you think the possible outcomes will be? They don't know. I mean, obviously, it's pretty clear to tell with a coin, but I'm thinking of like a game where you really don't know what's going to happen. But yeah, so according to that, so the pro player knows it has a depth of 1. They're able to see 1 level down, and the new player, so they have 1, and the new player has a depth of 0. And what is 1 minus 0? It's 1. So the depth of the game is 1, right? That makes sense? Good. And then similarly here, you basically have the same exact thing. So let's say you're playing WarioWare, all right? A pro player knows that there are a million different things that you can play, but all at the same level. At any point in time, you can either be playing this, or this. That's how it works. They know it's a depth of 1. The new player doesn't know what the heck WarioWare is. They have a depth of 0. So 1 minus 0 is equal to 1. Now here, it gets very weird. Because the new player, again, doesn't know what the game is, so they have a depth of 0. The pro player knows that, hey, I can use my boomerang, I can use my boomerang, it can rain in the game, and I can jump and freaking whatever, right? And then they can say, okay, well, I can use my boomerang, but this node is jumping, let's say. I can use my boomerang, and I can jump before throwing my boomerang, and it'll go farther. And if it's raining, I can use the lightning to cast my boomerang in lightning and then throw it at somebody, right? So the pro player knows that these are what can happen in the game because they know everything, right? Imagine the pro player is like the game itself. It knows everything it can do at any point in time and everything it can do at any point in time after this, related to this action, and any point in time after that. So they can traverse as far as you can possibly go without repeating a node, let's say. And let's say the depth of that is n. So the depth, according to this, of the difference between a pro player and a noob player is, let's write it over here, n minus 0, and spoiler warning, it's n. So the depth of the game is n, according to the definition that states that the depth of a game is the difference in knowledge between pro player and a new player. So yeah, that's why the depth of a coin flip, and I never ever want to come back to this because this is the most trivial thing ever. The depth of a coin flip is 1, and the breadth of a coin flip is 2. And until you can understand this, you shouldn't be talking about depth in games. Okay? Goodbye.